it's a treacherous journey, but I cannot applaud it enough because you have to do this for yourself. This is one life you have. You owe it to live it the best way. And the only best way to live it is through self-discovery.
Loverly presents The Wedding Podcast, a show for those on the road to I Do. From relationship advice to wedding planning tips, we break it down. I'm your host, Kelly Khalil, bride-to-be and the founder of Loverly, a DIY wedding planning platform. Over the years, we've helped tens of thousands of couples get down the aisle. And now that it's my turn, I'm not holding back. I'm bringing in my besties, wedding pros, and some brides-to-be you may know to talk through everything from picking the perfect venue to mastering your relationship. It's time to plan smarter so you can focus on the happily ever after. You've got the ring, we've got the rest. Welcome back to the Loverly Wedding Podcast. I am so excited to have our next guest on, who happens to be one of the relationship gurus I personally look up to. I've read her books. It's the incredible Dr. Shefali. She is a clinical psychologist, New York Times Bestselling Author, and international speaker. We talk all about love and marriage and divorce, also tips on mindfulness and a conscious relationship, and her best advice on conflict resolution. This was truly an honor to have her on the podcast. Get ready for an incredible conversation. Let's get into it. I can't say how excited I am to have Dr. Shefali on the podcast. My personal journey of discovering your work started in my early 30s, burned out, workaholic. Even though I had the success that I wanted, I found that I was not really fulfilled and happy. And a friend of mine had turned me on to your work. And ironically, the first book that I read was Conscious Parenting. And it really shifted and started to shape my self-discovery process. And I think so often we're talking about weddings and the excitement of planning the big day, and nobody talks about the relationship. So as someone that I look up to and read all your books, and I am a super fan, I'm so excited for you to share your point of view and your wisdom with our Loverly couples and brides-to-be. So thank you so much for joining.
Oh, absolutely. It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So for anyone who's been living under a rock and doesn't know you and your work, please tell us about yourself and how you got into this business and industry, and a little bit about your career.
Well, I'm a clinical psychologist, and so my business is to help people who are suffering or in chaos. And I'm also a practitioner of meditation and Buddhist philosophy. I've been raised in India. I live now in the West. So I've been able to integrate a way of working with people that incorporates both Western psychology and Eastern mystical spiritual traditions. And so I write books on consciousness, on mindfulness. I talk about parenting, women's empowerment, relationship issues, and just have perhaps a slightly different way of looking at things than most.
I think the way that you look at it is very refreshing. And there was a video that I saw recently. I think it's an old video of yours. It was like Relationship 101. It was on YouTube. And you were just talking about the basics of a relationship, from what happens physiologically to kind of how so much of our culture and society and individuals end up in partnership that maybe is not even right for them because of whatever it is, the chemistry, the culture, the pressure of their friends and family. Give us a little bit of a peek into that. Like, walk us through what happens when someone falls in love?
Well, first and foremost, I always say we don't fall in love, we fall in need, dependency, desire, a lot of lack, and a lot of need to possess and be possessed. Now, let's back up. We all grew up as children in this culture, made to feel that we were somehow not good enough. We were lesser than. And that's why I teach conscious parenting, so parents can help their children not feel like that. And we've grown up with this idea of romantic love, that there's one person out there that is going to meet all your needs. There is a soulmate. All these ideas are absolute and finite. And that's the problem. Because we have this fantasy that there's this one person out there who's going to meet our needs, and because we have so many needs from childhood, this is an inevitable cause for failure. The fantasy and the lack. We come with lack and we have this fantasy to be magically rescued and completed. This is the insanity that we're starting this journey with. Then we have the hormonal attraction and lust, which is really what falling in love is. It's falling in lust. It's falling in great excitement and euphoria, addiction and obsession, which is mostly hormonally based, but we think it's real. So the first 6 months is hormonal, but we think it's real. Then it becomes psychological and needy, and we think it's real. So when is it really real? When is it really real? It takes a long time to figure that out. And it can only be really real when it's first really real for ourselves. And by that time, we're already 80 years old. We've had the children. We've been through the hell. Now, it's this fantasy, this absolute, this institutionalization of love into marriage that is really the problem. Actually, we should be more fluid. We should live in community. We should have many people raising our children with us. We should be raising other people's children with our children. We should have many sources of support. And we should have many pair bonds. And they shouldn't be absolute and finite. When they're absolute and finite and we put all our eggs in this one basket and then call it a sin if we stray or we find somebody else, this is the cause for turmoil and trauma. We should have many love affairs and love many soulmates. Why not? There are many beautiful people who we match with at different phases of our lives. So anyway, and if we stay with one person, we should stay with the understanding that it should be a commitment that is renewable. It should be a renewable commitment, not a lifelong made in stone commitment when you're in your 20s and you're a fool. So anyway, our ideas are outdated, they are archaic, they are limited, and they are ignorant. And we deserve an enlightened approach to love. And I think that's missing. And it's needy of a big reframe.
So for a lot of people listening, that might sound somewhat radical, right? That there's not one person, there's not one path. But in reality, that idea is actually so freeing, right? It kind of takes the pressure off of the need for that one person to be everything to you, your partner, your lover, your co-parent, your roommate, all of these things that I think, for me, as I've been going through this journey with my fiance, almost 4 years, not married yet, everyone's always like, what's going on? Why aren't you, rushing to get married? And I remember something you said in that video was, why are we rushing to bring in the church, the government into your relationship? And what that actually does as far as build more pressure, right? Build more angst and almost raises the bar so that it's almost like you're afraid of failure. Like that's what's keeping you in partnership.
Yes, so this whole institutionalization of love through the social institute of love, the legal institute of love, and the religious institute of love. Now you have God and the judge and the parents, and of course, and culture's scorn if you get a divorce. I was divorced. I divorced after 25 years of being with the same person. And people, I'm sure, thought I had failed when I think I was a super success. 25 years is a long time. And it's okay to change, it's okay to grow apart. But people have such anathema around this idea of divorce, which is really outdated. But anyway, forgetting divorce, let's talk about the institutionalization of love. What pressure that puts on these two people to never be attracted to anyone else physically, to never attach to anyone else emotionally, and to be all things to all people. So it's a lot of pressure. And I think what we are not honoring in that is that we should get married, if we do, for growth, and not for compliance, not for control. And we should always commit to growth. And it's okay to grow apart, it's okay to grow together. But growth and not longevity needs to be the focus. But you know how we are today, right? Like, oh, you've been engaged for 3 years. Apparently, there's a time limit. Who knew? And then you're supposed to live together, and then there's a time limit. Like, oh, you've been married for 50 years. Ah, that is success. Who said that's the success? Right? I'm from India, and you go to at least 50% of Indian marriages that are long, life lasting, and the husband and wife live in separate rooms, separate floors, separate cities, right? It's a business arrangement many times, a social transaction. So don't be beguiled by the number of years. Be invested in, is the person authentic? Is the person growing? Is the person evolving? And is the couple good for each other in this phase of their life? We're not asking the right questions. We're focused on nonsense. And it's an illusion. It's a smoke screen. And it's really for cultural acceptance. And we need to be brave enough to break free from that.
It's so interesting. The cultural aspect of it is so real for so many people. My father is Lebanese. He's, essentially I'm first generation. My mother was American. But when I would go back to Lebanon with my father in my late 20s, they were concerned that I wasn't married yet. And then early 30s, they knew I was an entrepreneur. There was more concern. Like, she's difficult. There starts to be the
Yes.
language of the aunties kind of talking about it. And then I even saw how it translated, with my siblings who were married. The commentary on, oh, why are they not pregnant yet? Why are they not having kids? That there's that timeline, to the point that there was a joke in my family where we heard, an auntie, like, not a direct aunt, but, extended family saying, oh, it must be medical. Like there's like an issue. That's why they don't have children, right? And God forbid that, people want to forge their own path, that they're actually focused on building, partnership together that works for them. And that might not be in the exact kind of order. And so I've done things out of order, was living with my fiance before we were engaged. We bought a house, then we got engaged, not yet married. And after being in this wedding industry, like I said, for 10 years, early on, I started to get very, I don't want to say wary or jaded, because that wasn't it, but it was really hard for me when everyone asked me, well, you're the wedding person. What's your wedding going to be like? I couldn't even imagine what that wedding would be like when I didn't have the right partnership. And even now, having done the work, it's more of like not even really knowing what I wanted, right? Who I wanted, what I was looking for my future, right? And of course, you need to know that before you call in that person. So I know a lot of what you talk about is doing the work, the internal work first, right? Oftentimes people do it after, when a relationship doesn't work out, they get divorced, then that usually calls them to have some type of awakening and do the work. But what are some like things people should be doing when they are in serious partnership or they're trying to call in love to really get to know themselves and know what it is that they want for themselves?
Well, what we want for ourselves is always going to change, and that's okay. Number two, once the children come, you and your partner will become unrecognizable as parents because you've never been a parent before. And all the childhood issues that you thought you had resolved till that moment will show up in a way that you've never seen, and you will see your partner in a totally new way. It could be amazing, it could be really shitty. Your issues are going to be triggered in a new way. You're going to be a whole new person when you become a parent. So what we are going in is very different what we're going to be in the middle phase of raising children, if that's the path we take. And then we may change entirely by our 40s. I completely was a different human being by 45 than I was at 21 when I started my relationship with my ex. I was a whole new person, and and 6 years later, I'm a totally different person now. So we're going to evolve and change, and that's okay. So the commitment really is to growth. The commitment is to evolution. The commitment is to doing the inner work. You want to try to be the person who does the inner work, and that never ends. And you want to find somebody who does the inner work and doesn't end. But really doing the inner work, yeah? Not just saying they are doing the inner work because it looks good or feels good, but really committed to doing the inner work and committed to nonviolence and emotional safety, emotional growth. Because once you have nonviolence and emotional safety and emotional growth, that commitment, it doesn't matter then. You could fuck up, you could break up, you could be the worst failure. There's that net of emotional growth, emotional safety, and inner work. So I would say that's what you want to find and be committed to. Because then whether you're together or apart, it doesn't matter. You can relax. And I didn't know this when I was 21. I thought everyone was doing the work, everyone was emotionally safe.
21, which blows my mind. You know, I've talked about this before. When I first started this business of, you know, online wedding planning, the average age of brides in the US and grooms was 27 and 28. And now it's, you know, 32 and 33. And I think as you enter into your 30s, you know more of who you are and what you want. But I think about relationships I was in my early 20s, and I don't even recognize, you know, myself, period, right? And then it's laughable at the type of partners that, you know, I attracted and what I was looking for. And a lot of what you said is true, is that it's coming out of need, right? Need to be validated by a certain type of person, or almost like an addiction to an excitement if it's not necessarily a healthy type of relationship. So a lot of that stuff, you know, shifted for me as I started doing, you know, inner work. And I met my partner because he was a meditation teacher, and you know, I was in desperate need of calming the mind, and I think inner work is that foundation that you speak about, right? And it's the commitment to doing it long term. What are like some, for someone who's never done inner work and is in long-term partnership or trying to call it in, like where does someone start? Like what are the basics of starting to ask the questions and do the inquiry?
Well, you know, you start with a book, you know. So I wrote a book called A Radical Awakening to help women do exactly what we're talking about. So you can pick up my book, you can pick up somebody else's book. Pick up a book from a woman, if you're a woman, who has lived a little bit, loved a little bit, struggled a little bit, and begin to ask those same questions she does. Then take a course. You know, so for example, I have tons of courses, other people have courses. Attend a seminar, right? I do an annual summit, other people do. Like there's a prototype of what we teachers do. We write books, we do courses, we do summits, and open yourself up to following someone who you may resonate with, and begin to dare to go within. It is very unsettling at first to go within, because we've been so conditioned to go without, to go outside, that now to go within is so scary, because you will begin to uncover your bullshit, and then you begin to realize, wow, I didn't really want to be here. I'm just faking it because I want love, and now I see that I can give myself love, so now I don't need to be here, because all these courses and summits and books will teach you self-love, self-acceptance. And as you grow in self-love and self-acceptance, then you stop using the surrogates for that, and all those early relationships begin to alter because they were surrogates for the true deal, which is self-love. And once you begin entering self-love, now you attract a different level of partner, different level of friend. You don't tolerate the compromise, right? You don't tolerate the bullshit anymore. So that's why it's a treacherous journey, but I cannot applaud it enough, because you have to do this for yourself. This is one life you have. You owe it to live it the best way. And the only best way to live it is through self-discovery.
So one of the first books that I picked up was Conscious Parenting, which is funny. I thought it was like strange, and my sister was like, "You don't even have any kids. Why are you reading this conscious?"
Yeah, that's
parenting
my
book?"
first book. It's called The Conscious Parent.
Oh, The Conscious Parent. Yeah. So when I started reading it, I started to have a lot of more awareness of what patterns I had picked up from my parents, right? And two very different cultures, an American culture, Middle Eastern culture, and how, their traumas or their, ways that they expressed, whether it was communication or love, had shaped how I was seeking love out in the world. And so it was really eye-opening for me. And I've heard you talk about this in your other books, that we mirror the relationships from our childhood in our relationships. So we attract those people to teach us the lessons that are, not necessarily resolved yet, or the things we still need to learn. You've worked with so many couples and you've taught so many seminars. I'm just curious as to what are some of those patterns that show up in the relationship dynamic that, come from your parents that you see very often, or...
So you may not attract the exact person, of course, but you're attracting the same pattern. The same role that you played in childhood is typically the role you'll play in your next relationships till you break the pattern. So the typical one is the empath narcissist dynamic, the anxious avoidant partnership. Those are the most typical, where you're the fixer, the other person is more the avoidant user, you're the giver, they're the taker. And you have to begin to identify what kind of role you're playing typically in that relationship. And typically the giver, if they are pathologically giving or pathologically empathic, they're codependent, they're enmeshed, they're the fixers, the rescuers, the saviors. Or you're the controlling one, you're the taker, you're the narcissistic one. So there are lots of these dynamics, and in my book, A Radical Awakening, I talk about the different patterns women get into. So it's really important to recognize that, because that's what you're replaying. The same role that you got so good at playing in childhood, you go straight into the same pattern. I've played the same pattern in every relationship. I'm breaking free now, but man, I'm so good at playing that pattern, I don't even know I'm playing it, right? And the pattern is typically your basic temperament, but on steroids. So your basic temperament, and then you use it to get your needs met. So I was always a soft person in my childhood, but then I became so overly empathic that my softness became self-abduction. It became self-destruction. Like I became so soft I disappeared, right? That's not healthy. That's ridiculous. And in my own way, I was using people to meet my needs. And all of us are using each other to meet our needs. Some just do it through more pro-social ways. Some, like the narcissists, do it through more antagonistic ways, more depraved ways. And they are depraved ways. But the empath or the giver is also depraved, but to herself. The narcissist is depraved, but to others. But the empath is horrible to herself, you know? She's not nice to herself. And before anyone can be mean to her, she's already cruel to herself, you know? So we have to look at these patterns.
It's a sense of abandonment. It's almost of self abandonment because you're so worried about everyone else's feelings and emotions that you forget or you don't even recognize or acknowledge that you have your own.
Right. And where did we women learn? This is a rhetorical question. Where did we women learn to be cruel to ourselves? How is that okay? I literally never thought of that. I thought it was my role and goal and duty to be cruel to myself and be loving to others because I grew up in a culture where women were told to do that. And now I refuse to do that. I try to refuse to do that. It's very hard. But even now, when I'm loving to myself and I put myself first, I have huge guilt. And I'm raising a daughter who has no problem putting herself first. And I learned because I gave her non guilt to the point that she's a bit too much, not caring about other people. But the pendulum has to swing, right? So now I've swung it the other way with her. And hopefully in a few generations it'll come back to some normal. But she's definitely got a problem caring for other people more than herself. But I love that because I learned from her. Wow, she's capable of, either being an equal or putting herself first. Wow, I never don't even know what that looks like. So I learned from her, and that's what we have to do with each generation. We have to learn, but we have to first be daring to break some patterns.
So part of the pattern breaking starts with just general awareness, which a lot of the work that you teach is mindfulness. And how can people in partnership like bring mindfulness into their relationship, like together, right? To like, is there like meditate together, or is it like carving out time to have these conversations? Like, what are some things that couples can do who are already in partnership to kind of bring that into their relationship?
Well, we don't have to do it together. I think, in fact, we should mostly do it alone and then bring it to the relationship. I think when we look to do things together, then we already start off with this expectation of the other. And we should take permission for ourselves to do things on our own and forge the path on our own. And then if the other comes, it will be beautiful and effortless.
See, as you can tell, I have some codependent issues because everything
Yes.
I'm saying is like, how do we do it together? How do we align?
Right,
But
right.
I grew up in a household with 4 siblings and we were all 1 year apart and everything was together. And actually did not live on my own, like in my own apartment without a roommate until I was 31 years old. And it was so interesting because I remember I was like 30, 31, and I'm by myself, and I was like, gosh, it's so quiet. It's so quiet. And then that's when everything comes up, right? And so that's my tendency of wanting to be around people and needing that otherness around to kind of keep me going. Or, I'm like, oh, I'm an extrovert. I feel good around other people. But it's also that external validation, that you,
Yes.
that I require or I've needed to require. So that's one of my patterns. How when you're out in the world dating and looking for partnership, and I know maybe you shouldn't be looking, but you're out living and you're meeting people, if you're kind of on the single path, like how does someone recognize some of the potentially red flags that they're attracting the wrong partner or that they are maybe acting out? Like, what are some of those things that you see, those patterns?
Well, the first thing is that if you're both not in therapy, never been in therapy, chances are you're both acting out and will act out at some point. The second red flag is volatility, up and down, high and low, push and pull, dopamine, cortisol, dopamine, cortisol, dopamine, cortisol. This is trauma bonding. This is high anxiety. So we need to take a break, we need to reevaluate, we need to come back, we need to ask for help, we need to seek help, we need to heal and use the relationship to grow. And the minute we're doing this push and pull, that's a big red flag. Boom, 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 everything should stop. Right? If you're chasing and they're hot and cold, back and forth, up and down, high and low, these are the big red flags.
So, in relationship, conflict is kind of unavoidable. What are some of your tools or tips when you are in conflict with your partner?
Well, conflict is inevitable, but the degree of it, right, whether it's a disagreement or whether it's a war, depends on each person's and the collective consciousness. So we bring to the relationship a consciousness that can either make things worse or make things better, right? And it's based on our past childhood patterns. So most conflict occurs because of misunderstandings around unmet needs and expectations, but many of those unmet needs and expectations stem from childhood. So we have to be really aware of understanding, is this a pattern or is this something that's really coming up in the relationship? And in order for us to know the difference, we have to know ourselves and know our patterns, know our inner work, and do the inner work. So we can give easy conflict resolution tips like use I statements and make sure that you make eye contact and you don't blame. But ultimately, you will get stuck in a relationship rut if you're not aware of what your childhood baggage is and what are you bringing to the dynamic that you need to take care of.
Because oftentimes the fight is the same fight, it just looks a little different. It's the same wound or issue that, like, you keep bringing up because you haven't resolved it.
Right, and most of the wounding is typically around the same theme from both sides. It's, do you see me? Do you hear me? Am I valid? Am I worthy? Do you care? Am I important? And so we're all trying to answer the same question. When it becomes more than that, though, like abusive or somebody is disregarding or not present, then we have a more clear way to say, okay, this is not even my childhood patterns. This is somebody who's really abusing me. So that's why we have to be clear about, are these core emotional needs that I'm looking for a mommy and daddy to fulfill? And of course, it's okay to ask your partner to fulfill some of them, but they cannot fulfill all. Or is this real abuse? And we have to know the difference and we have to educate ourselves on that.
I love that. I know in a big theme in a lot of your books is about boundaries. Um, and for some people in relationship, they don't even know what that means. They think, oh, I'm in partnership. You and I are the same. We've become one. What's your perspective on boundaries in relationship?
Right. Boundaries are very important, very healthy, but they shouldn't be walls and they shouldn't be crumbling all the time either. I think when two people each have their own identity in their own path and their own worth, that's the best kind of togetherness. But when one or the other uses the relationship to create that identity, then you can become unboundaried. You can begin to go into the other person's lane. You can begin to lose your own sense of self. You can be used, you can be abused, you can abuse the other because you're using the relationship for your identity versus standing in your own power in that relationship.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think oftentimes when we decide that we want to get married, this idea of this two become one is actually the opposite, right? That that ends up creating a lot more issue because you lose your sense of self, you lose your sense of identity, and you almost attach who you are to your partner, which I imagine creates a lot more conflict, right? Because all now your expectation of them goes through the roof.
Yeah, this oneness that we're looking for is really because we're not one with ourselves. When we're one with ourselves, then we can find the person who matches that sense of connection, but the other person cannot fill that emptiness within us. And many times we use the other person to complete our incomplete selves.
So, switching gears a little bit, when you think about love, relationships, you think about sex and you think about intimacy. And I know that is a big challenge for couples, whether they've been together for 30 years or even if it's 2 years, right? Sometimes that dynamic changes, especially after they get married, or at least that's part of the narrative that's out there. I know you've spoken and you teach a lot about conscious intimacy. What does that mean? And give us kind of your magic spin on what that looks like in a relationship.
Yeah, sex is not intimacy, at least for men. For the typical male, it can be, for the typical male, but typically, sex is just sex for a male, and for a female, it means connection, and that's why males and females often get it all messed up because the female is looking for connection and the male is just looking for sexual release. It's just biological. So intimacy is something different. Intimacy is something more powerful, more connected, and it's about really removing barriers of separation through the physical and allowing the physical to be transcending into the spiritual, into the emotional. And very few people do have intimacy with another person because they're not even intimate with their own bodies and they're not connected to their own beauty and their own sexuality, their own organic, raw, primitive, natural sense of authenticity. So it's very hard for them to then show up, truly naked, emotionally, spiritually, and physically with the other person. And that's what intimacy requires, is a true emotional nakedness in front of the other.
That vulnerability, that ability to be your true self and ask for what you want and share kind of what you need. I am curious for you personally. You've obviously been through quite the journey. You've lived it and you've written about it and you teach about it. What would you say to your 21-year-old self who was just getting into your relationship and getting on that journey, if you could go back?
Well, I think I would definitely try to not get into a long term relationship. I did at 21, and I was too young. And I stayed in that relationship for 25 years. And while I have no regrets, I would advise all young people today not to get into long term bonds that early and wait till you're at least in your 30s, till you know yourself, you've figured yourself out, you've done some therapy. And I do think today's generation, your generation and younger, are waiting longer because it's just unhealthy to go into a long term commitment that young. Either go into it knowing it is probably going to change or end, or don't go into it at that point, because you restrict yourself with the consciousness of that person, and then both of you actually restrict each other because it's too young, too early, and now you're working off that young energy, and no one really gets a chance to grow up.
I think there's also data that our brains are not fully formed yet until like mid 20s, right?
Exactly. I don't know what I was thinking. Yes, I just thought I was so in love, and I was in the way I knew it back then, but now I know that was not love. That was just fear, infatuation, obsession, just real stupidity, really. I mean, no offense to my partner, and I think he should say the same thing about me. It's not about the person, it's about our general state of mind that we're really so young and dumb. And we should be making lifelong decisions then, but we think we were all, all that. And I'm so glad that the younger generations today are aware that they are not capable of making those decisions at that age.
Yeah, I think I shared earlier. The data is showing that we're delaying when we're getting married. We're prioritizing other things like career or travel or all of these other important individual kind of accomplishments before we're deciding to get married. And then
Yeah,
also we're moving in together, right?
yeah,
We're living together before we decide to make that next kind of, doing air quotes, permanent
yeah.
relationship commitment. So there's definitely been a shift.
Right, right, right. But having said that, it's okay if you make decisions to enter long-term bonds before you're ready, because the truth is you'll never really be ready. And it's okay to learn on the job, and it's okay to make mistakes, and it's okay to grow. Every relationship is here to grow us. So if your pain is going to come in your 20s, so be it. If it's going to come in your 30s, so be it. There is pain no matter what, but there's great growth. And as the motto is to use the lessons for growth, and not to get stuck. That's all. And not to regret, making, you know, each one makes our mistakes at the level of consciousness we had, and that's all we can do.
I feel like I could ask you questions forever. But I do know you are a very, very busy woman. But I'd love for you to share some of the top resources for anyone who is listening, who's interested in your work, who wants to start doing their own inner work. How can they tap into what you're sharing, your content? Where's the best place to find you?
Yeah, so I run an institute where I train people to be doing what I do in the world. So if people are interested in becoming a conscious parenting coach like I am, they can join the institute. I have lots of courses. Of course, I've written 5 books. So people can start anywhere, and to start with my Instagram page for starters. But I always put out free content that they can make use of.
And I know you have like a really great library of content on YouTube. I've watched quite a few of those videos. I think you also share them on Instagram. So we'll link definitely in the show notes so everyone can quickly click over to learn more from you. Of your 5 books, what do you think is the best place to start?
Well,
Um,
if you're a parent, they should start with my latest parenting book. It's called The Parenting Map. If you're a woman, then you can read A Radical Awakening.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time. I do appreciate it, and I'm so excited to share this conversation with our Loverly listeners. So thank you so much.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode. If you've enjoyed this podcast and want more inspiration and guidance, check out our new and improved wedding planning platform at loverly.com, where we offer free wedding planning tools and advice to get you hitched without a hitch. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram and TikTok at Loverly. Happy planning!